if you sit still long enough, the silence begins to remember you. It curls around your breath. It settles behind your eyes. And if you're not careful, you might hear something breathing back. They say ghosts scream, but not here, not in Waverly. Here, the dead only whisper, high on the lonely hills just outside Louisville, Kentucky. The forest opens like a wound, and there it sits, concrete bones tangled in ivy and time, 5 silent stories tall, windows gaping like mouths that have forgotten how to speak. Waverly Hills. Built in 1910, it was meant to be a refuge, a place of air and light for those who couldn't breathe. Tuberculosis had no mercy in those days. It crept in through crowded slums, factories, homes thick with coal smoke and silence. Whole families coughed themselves into graves. And so Waverly rose, cold, clean, and far away from the world. They called it a sanatorium. They meant it to be hope. But you and I, we know better than that, don't we? More than 60,000 souls passed through its halls over the decades. Some walked out cured, most did not. They died in rooms where sunlight couldn't reach. They died gasping, alone, wrapped in bedsheets, soaked in fever. They died waiting for letters that never came. There was a tunnel beneath the hill, long, sloping, hidden from view. They called it the body chute. Nurses used it to carry the dead out discreetly, so the living wouldn't see how many were leaving each day. And then there's room 502, 5th floor, nurses' wing. The stories say one woman jumped, another was found hanging. They say something still waits up there, watches from the doorway, waits for the brave or the foolish to step inside. It closed in 1961. The medicine had changed. The building hadn't. For a time, it was left to rot. The vines grew thicker. The roof caved inward like a sigh. Even now the rain sounds different on that roof. Quieter, more thoughtful. People still go inside. Ghost hunters. Dare seekers. Children who've grown up on dares and grainy online videos. They bring flashlights and recorders, hoping to catch a sound, a shape, a whisper. But Waverly doesn't care about your cameras. It remembers every breath, every death, every name that was never said again. And now, so do you. Before we begin, take a deep breath. And if you haven't already, follow this voice into the dark. Because once we start, you'll want to hear how it ends. Tonight, we remember Waverly, and Waverly remembers us. It begins with mist, not the kind that creeps, not the kind that warns. No, this mist waits. It curls low across the forest floor, pale as diluted milk, and settles along the path that winds up to Waverly like an old scar. One cut so many times, it forgets how to heal. You feel it before you see it. The air changes, not colder, not yet, but thinner, like memory before it vanishes. The trees hush as you pass them, not because they're afraid, but because they remember too. It's strange, isn't it? How places can feel alive. Waverly always did. They built it high above the city for a reason. Tuberculosis was called the White Plague, and it did not care who you were. It ate the lungs from the inside out. And in the early 1900s, no one knew how to stop it. They believed in air, in sun. So they built this place where the wind never rested, where every window opened wide, letting in the breath of the hill and letting out something else. The sanatorium began as a 2-story frame building in 1910, meant to house just 40 patients. But the plague didn't pause. Neither did the architects. It grew, stone by stone, until by 1926 it was a monolith. A fortress of healing, they said. 5 stories tall, designed to hold over 400 patients. But numbers are lies sometimes. Ask the walls. They held more than that. Ask the floorboards. They sag under the weight of what isn't there anymore. They arrived in wagons, cars, on foot. Whole families coughing into handkerchiefs, eyes hollow, hoping this place would do what doctors could not. The children came too. There was a separate wing for them. Laughter still echoes there, brittle, too light, like breath through broken glass. It doesn't belong anymore, but it refuses to leave. A normal day at Waverly Hills was not quiet, not then. There were the carts, rolling from room to room, wheels singing across tile. Nurses in white, the clink of metal trays, the wet rasp of breath drawn too slowly, and the coughs, always the coughs, like punctuation in the air. 1 cough meant infection. 2 meant time was running out. 3, you learned to stop counting. Patients lay wrapped in woolen blankets on sun porches, even in winter, their bodies shivering but faces tilted toward the sky. They believed fresh air would clean the sickness from the lungs, that if you just breathed enough, it might not find you, but air is not medicine, and hope is not a cure, and Waverly does not forgive liars. I walked the main hall first. It curves, gently, unnaturally long, the kind of long that bends your sense of time. Doors line the corridor, their paint peeling, numbers barely clinging to the wood. Some open, some do not, but they all watch you. Your footsteps feel wrong here, like they aren't yours. I paused by a window, just as the last of the evening light died against the frame. The glass is gone, but the shape of the panes remains in shadow. You can almost see the outline of someone's hand pressed to it once. Small, delicate, a child maybe, waiting for someone who never made it up the hill. Or perhaps they did, and left by another door entirely. That's the thing about Waverly. It doesn't haunt you like stories do. It remembers you back. If you speak, it answers, not with words, but with breath. A soft shift in the air behind your shoulder. A gentle nudge against your sleeve when there's no breeze. A whisper that doesn't form a sentence. Just a syllable of longing, or warning, or recognition. There are rooms here that feel empty, and rooms that pretend to. The dining hall still smells faintly of bleach and boiled potatoes. The surgical theatre is missing its equipment, but not its silence. The children's wing. We will come back to that. Not yet. Not tonight. For now, we keep walking. Past the room with the green tiles that hum. Past the wall of patient photos, their smiles stiff and eyes unfocused. Snapshots taken just before the breath turned ragged, just before the silence fell. In the darkness ahead, a door is open, not ajar, open. And beyond it, a stairwell spirals upward, all the way to the 5th floor, all the way to room 502. But that's not where we're going yet. Down here, in the quiet part of the building, there is something else, something older, something that doesn't wait in a room. It moves. Some say it's the shape of what the sanatorium tried to forget. Some say it was never human at all. But I say it is made of breath, of all the ones who never got theirs back. I saw it once. No eyes, no face, just presence. It filled the hallway like fog, and then it waited. I didn't ask its name. Waverly doesn't like questions. It prefers you listen. And tonight, that's all you have to do. Listen, breathe slow, and remember, we're only on the 1st floor, and Waverly goes much deeper than that. The thing about silence is that it doesn't stay still for long. It shifts. It creaks. It seeps into corners, filling the spaces where shadows fall. And in a place like this, the silence never feels empty. It feels waiting. I followed the winding hallways, a crooked path through rooms that once hummed with life. Now they only whisper. But you have to listen carefully, because what you'll hear isn't what you think. At first, it's just the air, thin, cold, and heavy. It presses against your skin, makes you long for warmth that isn't there. The floorboards groan beneath your feet, and the scent of decay clings to the walls like perfume left too long in a drawer. But then, there's something else, a low murmur, almost a sigh. The first time I heard it, I thought it was just the wind. It wasn't. It's easy to forget that Waverly was never just a hospital. Not entirely. It was a small world, self-contained, its own rhythms, its own rituals. Patients arrived in the morning, carried in from the hill, some of them still hopeful. Some were barely breathing. They came for a cure, or at least to wait out the worst of it, to survive long enough for medicine to catch up. But the truth? The truth is, most never did. There was no cure for tuberculosis, not then. And so, Waverly became a place of endings, not beginnings. Each room told a story, a slow unfolding of pain and slow grinding hope. The second and third floors, they were the busiest. More people, more breathing, more waiting. You could hear the shuffle of slippers along the linoleum, the soft rasp of oxygen tanks in the corners, the coughing that would build to a crescendo, fade, and then start again. They didn't talk about the ones who didn't make it, not openly, but there were quiet glances and hushed tones between the nurses. You could feel it too, the way the rooms shifted in the quiet. Some rooms didn't feel as alive as the others. You could stand in the doorway and feel the weight of it pressing down on you. The stillness thickening like a fog. The silence bending in ways that made the walls seem too close. But they couldn't hide from it. No one could. Because Waverly is always watching. I remember stepping into one of those rooms. The air in there was heavy with something I couldn't place. No draft, no breeze. Just a weight, hanging in the corners. And then I heard it. A whisper. It sounded like a name or a plea. Maybe a name was a plea. It didn't come from anywhere specific. It came from everywhere. Like it was part of the building itself. Soaked into the wood and plaster, the stone foundation, the very floor you stand on. Some say it's the souls of the patients left behind. But they don't talk. Not like that. Not in this place. This was something older. Something that had been here far longer than the first brick was laid. That's when I understood. Waverly isn't just haunted by the dead. It is the dead. They are woven into every floorboard, into every stain that won't come out, into every forgotten detail, the last swing of a nurse's apron, the final breath of a child left alone. And if you stand still long enough, you'll start to hear them. You might hear the faint sound of boots on the floor above, the whisper of a name in the next room, a cough that echoes when the air around you is still. It's like the building breathes with them. No one can say when it started, but I believe Waverly has always kept the memory of its patients. Those who never made it out, the ones who just faded away into the shadows, and each one of them left behind something, a sound, a feeling. A small fragment of their story clings to the walls, waiting for someone to notice it. I found myself standing at the top of the stairs, looking down the hallway. I don't know what I expected. Something to move, someone to call out. But the hallway was quiet now. Too quiet. Like the whole building had decided to hold its breath with me. I stepped forward, and that's when it happened again. The whisper. This time it was clearer, a name, a question, and a touch. There was nothing visible, no shadow to follow. But that touch, it lingered in the air like a broken note of a lullaby, familiar, haunting, the kind of thing that never fades, no matter how hard you try. And as the darkness pressed in on the edges of the room, something shifted. The wall, it seemed to pulse, once, twice, slow and steady like a heartbeat. And suddenly, the silence didn't feel empty anymore. It felt alive. Perhaps it was a trick of the mind, the weight of history pressing down, the stories of suffering and death that left their mark on every corner. Perhaps it was just the building, shifting in the quiet. But I can't help but think, maybe they were never truly gone, not the ones who had walked these halls before. Maybe they're still waiting for someone to hear them, to remember them, or perhaps to join them. And somewhere, beyond the heavy air and the darkened corridors, I knew we weren't alone. Something was moving in the silence. Something was waiting. Have you ever felt like the air around you is no longer a gift? Like it's not yours to breathe? As if each exhale could be your last. Each inhale a silent exchange. A trade you weren't meant to make. That's how Waverly feels. I stood in the hallway. The whisper had faded, but something else remained. A presence quiet, unshakable, like a shadow woven into the very walls. I could feel it pressing against my back, brushing softly against my skin. Waverly had touched me. I knew, without a doubt, that I wasn't alone. I turned, taking the stairs, one step at a time, as if they too were alive. They creaked underfoot, groaning like they were carrying the weight of years. Not just stone and iron, but the unspoken, the forgotten, the things no one dares to remember. Each step led me upward, but the silence remained thick, oppressive. I could feel my breath becoming shallow. The air was heavy, heavy in a way that made my skin prickle. Every corner seemed to watch. Every crack in the walls seemed to breathe. And then I reached the 5th floor. There's a myth about the 5th floor. People say it's the floor where the worst of the disease took hold, the last chance for survival before the inevitable came. The windows are high, but there's always an odd light in that room, a slanted, golden kind of glow that doesn't seem to belong to the world outside. But it isn't the light that draws people to room 502. It's the silence that follows you inside and wraps itself around your throat like a hand that's been there too long. The kind of silence that feels like it's been waiting for you, watching you. Room 502, they say, is a place that carries a curse. Nurses. Well, they used to talk about it in hushed tones when they thought no one was listening. They called it a bad room. There were rumours. Tragedy that could not be explained. One woman, a nurse, had been found hanging there, in room 502. No one knew why. No one knew who would do such a thing. Another nurse, just a few years later, had fallen to her death from the same window. I don't know if it was the tragedy of it all, or something more sinister, but I couldn't resist the pull. I had to see it for myself. I moved down the hallway, my footsteps slow and careful, as though the floorboards themselves were listening. I reached the door. It was slightly ajar, a sliver of darkness spilling out into the hallway. Inside, the air was thicker, suffocating almost. It clung to my skin like old fabric, worn and familiar. A soft ache filled the space. Not the kind you feel with your body, but with something deeper. A loss that cannot be quantified. A grief that lingers even when the bodies are long gone. I stepped inside. The air was cooler in here, but still that oppressive weight hung in the corners. Room 502 is simple. White walls, a single bed. nothing remarkable. But the silence, it's alive here. It presses against you like it's waiting for you to hear something you've forgotten. Something from the past. Or maybe something from before the past. I don't know how long I stood there. Long enough for my eyes to adjust to the dim light. Long enough for the room to settle into the creases of my memory. The whispers seemed closer now. Not louder, but more persistent. The air seemed to move, as if something were reaching out from the past, trying to touch me. I stepped forward. The floor beneath me creaked as I approached the far corner of the room. My heart began to beat harder in my chest, thudding with an urgency I couldn't explain. And then I saw it. A chair, darkened with age, was pushed against the wall. Its legs were chipped, but there was something about it. Something that made my stomach twist. The chair felt wrong. I leaned closer. A small, delicate object lay upon it. It was a photograph, faded, yellowing with time. It must have been left there by someone, maybe a nurse, maybe a patient, a forgotten soul who had walked these halls long ago. The picture was of a woman, young, in a nurse's uniform. Her smile was soft, but her eyes... There was something in her eyes, a sadness deep and unspoken. And as I stood there holding that photo, I swear I felt a movement behind me, a shift in the room. I turned quickly, the photograph still in my hand. But nothing was there. The room was as still as before. But the air had changed, the silence had thickened. I stepped back, trembling, the whispers in my ears now becoming words, words I couldn't quite catch, but they were calling to me, to someone. I dropped the photograph. The floorboard creaked beneath my feet, louder than it should have been. Something was watching me now. It said that when you walk into room 502, you're never really alone. There's something here. A piece of the past that never truly left. Something unfinished, something lost. And when you step back into the hallway, it follows you. Not with footsteps, not with sight, but with a quiet, almost imperceptible pull, like gravity. It stays with you, in the back of your mind. And I knew then. I knew that Waverly wasn't just a building. It was a keeper of stories. But the stories it keeps are not always ones you want to hear. It's strange, isn't it? How you can feel watched, without a single glance upon you. How the weight of attention can settle into your bones without a voice, without a touch. A gaze from somewhere you cannot name, that chills you, even when the room is empty. I left room 502 behind me, the air in my lungs heavier now. The photo, the woman's face, lingered behind my eyes like a shadow, even as I moved through the hallway, each step muffled by the thick silence. But it wasn't just the room that made me feel uneasy. It was the sense that I wasn't the only one there anymore. Somewhere, deep in the bones of Waverly Hills, there was an awareness, something that moved, not in the way of flesh, but in the way of memory. Something that had watched every moment of suffering, every breath drawn, and every death whispered in the dark. And as I moved, I could feel its gaze, its attention. It was as if the building itself had turned to see what I was doing there. You could feel the building breathe with you, if you paid attention. And right now, its breath felt heavy. It didn't want me here anymore, but I had already crossed its threshold. There was no turning back. I couldn't shake the sensation that the walls had eyes, not in the way we understand eyes, not in the tangible human sense. No, these eyes were made of something older than the wooden beams and crumbling plaster, something from the depths of the earth, crawling through the cracks of the foundation. weaving itself into the very air. You might think that when a place falls to ruin, it becomes lifeless. You might think that when the doors are closed and the halls grow dark, the spirits are what remain, flickering, restless, broken. But that isn't true, is it? No, a place like this remembers. Waverly remembers those it held. It remembers them far longer than they remembered themselves. And in the quiet moments, when the wind isn't whispering and the floorboards are still, the walls speak. They remember. I moved deeper into the building, trying to find a way to shake the feeling of being watched. The second floor, as I remember it, was almost too quiet. There was no breeze here, no faint sounds of footsteps from the rooms, no shifting of the old walls. It was just me, and that oppressive weight that pulled on the air. And that's when I heard it again. The whisper. This time it came from the hallway, soft like breath, but different. Not the cold murmurs of the past, not the echoes of someone long gone. No, this whisper felt alive. It moved. I froze. My heart thrummed against my chest, so loud it drowned out the subtle hum of the building around me. And then I heard it again, a voice, clear and steady. It spoke my name, not out loud, not in the air, but in my mind. It wasn't the name I'd been given at birth. It wasn't the name that had ever belonged to me. It was something else, something from a place that had not yet finished. I turned on my heels, my pulse thundering in my ears, and I faced the direction of the whisper. No one was there. But the air felt full now, heavier. It seemed to vibrate with something that wasn't human. That wasn't supposed to be here. Waverly wasn't haunted by the dead, I realised then. Not entirely. The dead don't linger like this. They move on, eventually. What remained here, in the deep recesses of the building, wasn't just memory. It wasn't simply the voices of those who had died. It was something that had grown from those memories. Something fed by sorrow, by lost souls, by the unfinished business of a place that held death so close. It wasn't a ghost. It wasn't a spirit. It was a presence, a consciousness that had taken form from the very suffering Waverly had housed. Something that breathed alongside the living and the dead. Something that had absorbed all that was left behind. And now I knew it had seen me. I made my way toward the stairwell that would lead me to the lower floors. Each step felt deliberate, as though the building was measuring my every movement. The walls, once silent, now seemed to press closer. Not in anger, not in malice, just in awareness. They were watching, waiting. By the time I reached the bottom of the stairs, I could almost hear the faint scraping of nails against stone. Faint, far away. But it was there. It wasn't in the air, like a noise. No, it was in the fabric of the building, in the structure itself. I had crossed a threshold, crossed into a place where the line between the living and the dead was blurred, where the very walls seemed to possess a mind of their own. It was as if they knew you before you entered, as if they had seen you long before you arrived. And that's when I realised something else. Something that stopped my breath for a long moment. Waverly wasn't just a place of suffering. It wasn't just a hospital. It was a collector. It collected memories. It collected pain. And once you stepped into it, once you stayed, you too would be remembered, a part of the place that would never truly leave. The air had grown cold now, despite the warmth of the day. It curled around me, thick and suffocating, as I moved deeper into the heart of the building. I wasn't sure what I was looking for anymore. Maybe answers, maybe a way out. But the truth? I knew it already. Waverly never lets go. It keeps what it takes. Forever. They say the heart of a place is always the darkest. Waverly, with its haunting beauty, its cracked tiles and abandoned wings, has a heart. It's buried deep beneath its rotting floors and sagging walls, a place most never see, most never even know about. The death tunnel, the body chute. It's easy to mistake it for a ghost story, a curiosity. But I knew, standing in that dim hallway, that what lies beneath is far darker than any myth can conjure. It was never meant to be a secret, not really. It was practical, in the early days, a way to move the dead out of sight quickly so the living wouldn't be reminded of how often they were left behind. The body chute was a long, narrow tunnel running beneath the hill. It sloped gently down, leading to the back of the property, where a truck could pick up the bodies and transport them to the undertaker. But it wasn't the speed that mattered. It was the fact that it was hidden. It was a quiet, discreet passage for the dead, an artery that carried life out of sight, away from the eyes of those still hoping to survive. It's strange, isn't it, how easily we forget death when it's not in our face, when it's hidden away, buried out of sight. We think it has no place in the light, that it only belongs in the dark, and for Waverly that dark is far deeper than most realise. I stood there in the entryway of the tunnel, a door behind me open and empty. The world above seemed so far away now, the fading sun, the wind stirring the trees outside. Here, in this place, there was no breeze, no light, only the quiet hum of the building itself. And then, the silence changed. It wasn't the soft, oppressive weight that had followed me through the halls. This was something different. This was waiting. The tunnel had been sealed off long ago, but the air still stirs in places like this, like the remnants of a heartbeat that refuses to stop. I took a step forward and immediately felt the shift in temperature. It was colder here. Not a simple chill, but a deep, biting cold that seemed to come from the very earth below. The walls, once white and clean, were now streaked with the remnants of time. Cracks in the plaster, rusted pipes running overhead, the faintest traces of something else. The light from the hallway behind me barely made a dent in the shadows. The tunnel seemed to stretch forever, darker and deeper than it should have been, and that's when I heard it, a soft, distant scraping, like metal on stone. It was faint, a whisper almost, but it was there. And in that moment, I knew I wasn't the only one standing in this place. The tunnel felt alive, like it remembered every body it had ever carried, every soul it had seen pass through. The cold wasn't just temperature anymore. It was something heavier, something rooted in the foundations of the sanatorium. I couldn't tell you how far the tunnel stretched. The darkness was too thick, too suffocating. It seemed to stretch for miles, but in truth, it could have been only a few yards. I tried to take another step, but my legs felt heavy, sluggish, as if the ground beneath me was pulling me down. The farther I went, the harder it became to breathe. And then it whispered again. Not my name this time, but a voice, deep, slow, dragging itself up from the earth. They never leave. A quiet promise, a fact, and something older than time itself. I felt the words settle over me, like hands pressing gently against my chest. They were right. Waverly doesn't let anyone go, not the dead and not the living. I looked around the tunnel again. No matter how long I stared into the shadows, no matter how deeply I peered into the dark, I couldn't see past it. But I could feel something, waiting, something that had always been there, something that would never leave. You know, some stories are passed down through the ages, legends of haunted places, the whispered tales of rooms where time collapses, where the past presses in on the present, until it all feels like one endless memory. But Waverly's story is different. It doesn't need to be told. It remembers itself. I turned finally and walked back toward the mouth of the tunnel, but the pull was still there. It lingered like a breath against my ear, like something tugging on the back of my mind. There was nothing to see in that darkness, nothing but a cold, empty space where death had once walked freely. And yet I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't quite empty. Not at all. The body chute, I realised, wasn't just for carrying the dead out of Waverly. It was also how they entered. I reached the door, pulled it open, and stepped back into the light of the hallway. The air here was warmer, still heavy with history, but it felt cleaner. Still, the echo of the tunnel remained in my chest. That voice, the promise, the weight of everything that had ever walked through this place, and every soul that had crossed its threshold. They hadn't gone anywhere. They were still here, waiting. And the truth settled in deep in my bones. Waverly doesn't just keep memories, it keeps souls. And some of them never stop walking. You know, it's easy to forget that time doesn't work the same in places like Waverly. Here, the clocks don't tick forward, they only whisper. And when you listen closely enough, you might hear them. The lost souls, the ones who never truly left. They don't haunt you in the ways you might expect. No rattling chains or cold, spectral fingers brushing against your skin. No shrieks in the night or flashes of pale faces in the corner of your vision. They wait. And when you least expect it, when you think the silence has finally returned, you'll hear them. Not in the air. Not as a whisper from the past, but as something more present. Something that walks beside you, with you, in the dark. I had only taken a few steps away from the body chute when I felt it again. That weight. The presence. It wasn't the building. It was them. Those who had walked Waverly's halls long ago. At first, I thought I imagined it. After all, what is a building but a collection of memories and shadows? What are the walls but the ghosts of human hands, the echoes of those who built, loved, or suffered within? But no, this was different. The footsteps were too deliberate, too heavy to be mere echoes. They were real, and they were walking with me. I turned, my breath catching in my throat, but no one stood behind me. The hallway stretched on, as empty as before, but I could feel it. The cold brush of air, the faintest disturbance in the stillness. They were there, right behind me. It didn't take long before I realized they were moving with purpose, not random, not lost, but moving towards something, toward me. My pulse quickened. Waverly had always felt alive, but this was different. There was nothing comforting in this presence. No sense of the past being close, of being merely watched. This was something, watching but not waiting. Something hunting, maybe, or something calling. My mind screamed at me to run, but I didn't, not yet. The floors of Waverly creaked beneath my feet, but now they felt like a warning. The sound seemed to shift, as though the building was trying to speak to me in its own language. It was hollow here, quieter, as if the darkness had drawn closer. I reached the nurse's wing, and that's when I realized I hadn't meant to come here. My feet had simply carried me. There was no planning, no decision. I'd simply followed the footsteps. Room 502, the room that had first touched me, was still at the end of the hall. The door was closed now, but I could feel the pull of it, like an invisible thread tied around my chest, tugging me forward. But this time, I didn't go in. Instead, I stood there, watching the door, and the world around me fell into perfect silence. It was as though the entire building had stopped breathing. I could feel the weight of what had happened here. The nurse found lifeless, the other woman lost to that same room. How many had stood in this same spot, pulled by the same call? How many had looked at that door and felt the same compulsion? I felt as though I was standing on the edge of something far deeper than I could understand. I had known, somewhere deep inside me, that I would return to this room. But standing here, watching the faint outline of the door in the darkened hallway, I was no longer sure if it was me doing the walking, or if it was them. The air in the hallway had shifted again. It wasn't cold, not in the way it had been before. No, this felt like the air had moved, like the space itself had opened and closed. A door had opened behind me, though I hadn't heard it, hadn't felt it. It was the kind of coldness you feel at the back of your neck when you know someone has just walked into the room. But no one had. And yet, I felt the presence, stronger now. I turned quickly. No one. The footsteps had stopped. The air hung still. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, holding my breath, waiting for something to shift. I couldn't explain it. There was no tangible reason to feel the way I did, but the building, Waverly, it had changed in that moment. The darkened hallway was alive with something ancient now. The dead didn't just linger here anymore. No. They walked alongside me, beside me, without a word, without a sound, always close enough to touch. And that's when I understood. Waverly doesn't just collect memories. It doesn't just keep the lost souls of the dead. No, it makes them. It shapes them. It creates them. In the silence, in the darkness. I couldn't stand still any longer. I stepped back from the door, the sound of my own breath seeming too loud now. And the moment I moved away, the weight in the hallway seemed to shift. It followed me. The footsteps, the shadows, the presence. There was no escape. I turned and walked quickly, as though by will alone, my heart pounding in my chest. But no matter how quickly I moved, I could still feel them, just behind me. Waverly had wrapped itself around me, and it wasn't letting go. It's strange, isn't it? How fear doesn't always make you run. Sometimes it simply makes you move. Not away, but deeper. That's what Waverly does. It doesn't chase. It doesn't scream. It waits. And it draws you in, slowly, quietly, until you're so entangled in its grip, you don't even remember how you got here. I could still feel it. Those eyes, following me, never once leaving my back. The building had become a labyrinth, its walls shifting, pressing in closer with every step I took. Each hallway seemed to twist the one before it. Every corner became unfamiliar, every door a new challenge. But it wasn't the walls that made the world feel so wrong. It was the presence. It wasn't the building watching me anymore. It was them, the ones who walked with me, who followed without a sound, who waited just behind the edges of the light. I found myself in the children's wing. I hadn't meant to come here either. But the pull, it was undeniable. It was a kind of quiet command, like a thread tugging gently at my chest. I had to follow it, to see what lay at the end. The first thing you notice in the children's wing isn't the emptiness. It's the quiet. It's the kind of silence that feels alive, almost too thick to breathe through. And the longer you stand there, the more you start to feel like you're not supposed to be here. Like the air itself is holding something back. The walls are pale here, faded, stained with time. The beds are gone, the cribs long since taken away. But something about the room remains. Something small. Something that hasn't left. I stood in the centre of the room looking around. There were old drawings on the walls, Some faded, some barely there, like ghosts left behind by the children who once coloured them. And the floor was marked with what appeared to be small handprints, faint and barely visible. They weren't made by hands, not human ones anyway. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, that the darkness had twisted my mind, playing tricks on me. But then I saw it, in the corner of the room, a shadow that wasn't quite a shadow, a flicker, a movement too fast to be real. I stepped closer, and the air grew colder. It wasn't the air, though. It was something else. Something small, something that fit right into the corners, the dark spaces where the light never reached. I could feel it now, the presence. It was more than the footsteps I'd heard earlier. This was something different, something I couldn't see, but knew. I stepped forward, and the room seemed to stretch, the walls leaning in, the shadows deepening until they filled the space. It was as if the building itself had breathed with me, expanding and contracting until I was in a place that felt both ancient and new. And then I saw it. A small figure, barely visible, standing at the far end of the room. It was childlike, almost delicate, but there was something wrong about it. It was there, but it wasn't. A blur of motion, a flicker at the edges of my vision. And yet I could feel it. It was watching me. I reached out, but my hand faltered. It was then that I understood. The children who had once lived here, their laughter, their tiny feet running along the floors, had never truly left. They had simply waited. They were still here, lingering in the forgotten corners, in the places where no one else dared to look, waiting for someone to remember them, waiting for someone to see them. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the feeling that had begun to settle in the pit of my stomach, that the children weren't alone. They were with something that had crawled in from the walls, something that had made itself known in the cracks and the dark places, in the coldness that clung to the building. I felt a cold hand press against the back of my neck, but when I spun around, no one was there. The room, the air, felt like it had taken a step closer. I could hear them now. The whispers, faint, soft, inhuman, a child's giggle, a voice too young to speak, yet somehow knowing. And then, the footsteps. But they weren't just behind me anymore. They were all around me. I turned again, but this time the room had changed. It was smaller. The walls felt closer, tighter. The doorway that had been behind me moments before was now a black hole, an entrance to a place that didn't exist, a place where the shadows had swallowed everything whole. I could still feel the children. I could still feel them. I took a step back, then another. My heart was racing, each breath more shallow than the last. And with every step I took, the whispers grew louder. They were closer. It wasn't just the children anymore. There were other voices, older voices, voices that had never spoken a word while they were alive. And now they whispered to me. They had found me. I stumbled toward the exit, toward the hallway. I didn't know where I was going, didn't know how to escape the feeling of being watched from every direction. The walls were no longer still. They seemed to pulse with the breath of the building, the breath of those who had never truly left. And then, at the edge of the hallway, I saw the door to the basement, the stairs that led downward. Waverly was calling me. I don't know how long I stood there, but when I turned to walk back toward the stairs, the presence behind me was no longer in the shadows. It had stepped forward, and it was waiting for me, There's a weight to the dark that you can't explain, not until you feel it pressing against you, not until it begins to close in around your ribs, until every breath you take feels like a plea, a desperate attempt to pull air from a place that no longer knows how to give. And it was in that moment, standing at the foot of the stairs that led to the basement, that I felt it. That heaviness, that unshakable presence, moving just behind me, just at the edges of my sight. It was no longer subtle. It wasn't a whisper in the air. It wasn't just a brush against my skin or a soft pull at the edges of my thoughts. This time, it was right there. The basement, you see, isn't like the rest of Waverly. You don't speak of it in hushed tones like the nurse's wing or room 502. It's a place most never reached, not even when the building was full. It wasn't meant to be seen. It was never meant to be known, and the deeper you go, the darker it becomes, until it seems as though the very foundations of the building are turning their back on you. The steps creaked as I descended, the sound of my own movements too loud in the thick silence. The walls here were bare, no paintings, no photographs, no remnants of those who had passed through, just stone, rough and unforgiving, as if the building itself had forgotten how to be soft. The deeper I went, the colder it grew, not just in temperature, but in something else, something that pressed against my chest, a chill that came from the inside, a cold that seemed to emanate from the earth itself, from the very ground beneath my feet. I don't know why I kept moving forward. Maybe it was the pull of the building, maybe the way it seemed to have its hands on me, guiding me, making me feel as if there was nowhere else to go but deeper into its heart. Or maybe, just maybe, it was the feeling that if I didn't walk through that door at the bottom of the stairs, I'd never leave. The basement was a place of shadows. The few lights that flickered on long dead bulbs cast a sickly, flickering glow. The air was thick, musty, and old. The faint sound of dripping water echoed in the distance. But there was something else, something off. There were no doors down here, no rooms, just a vast open space that seemed to stretch far beyond what I could see. The floor was uneven, cracked in places where roots and time had clawed their way through. But it wasn't the floor or the walls that unnerved me. It was the emptiness, the feeling of being in a place where the air itself had never been disturbed, where the silence was a living thing, pressing in on all sides, suffocating, thick, heavy. It was a place that no one was ever meant to witness. I walked further in, but every step I took, I felt the pull grow stronger. The sensation of being followed, of being watched, had turned into something tangible. The air was thick now, heavy with intention. I turned a corner, and that's when I saw it. The centre of the room. A large, rusted grate, partially open, as though it had once been part of a ventilation system or some other long-forgotten utility. But it wasn't the grate that caught my attention. It was what was beneath it, the tunnel. It stretched out far beneath the floor, disappearing into the blackness, winding down into the earth like some sort of forgotten artery of the sanatorium, a pulse that had never stopped beating. I don't know why I leaned closer, why I peered into that darkness, but I did. And as I did, I felt a wave of cold so intense it cut through me like a knife. It whispered up from the tunnel, a sound so low and so ancient it felt as though the earth itself was sighing in its sleep. And then I heard it. A faint shuffle, a dragging of feet, soft and slow, coming from the depths of the tunnel. It wasn't the scurrying of rats. It wasn't the creak of the building settling. No. This was something that moved with purpose, and as it drew closer, I could feel my breath catch in my throat. I don't know how long I stood there, but in that stillness, time seemed to stretch. I should have run. I should have turned away. But instead, I stood there, rooted to the spot, my feet frozen, unable to break away from the pull. And then it emerged. From the darkness, from that suffocating blackness, something moved, slow, deliberate, and wrong. It was a figure, but not one you could call human. It was too tall, too long, and its limbs moved in a way that defied nature. It dragged itself out of the tunnel, its face hidden in shadow, its features obscured. But there was something about the way it moved, the way its limbs stretched and bent unnaturally, that sent a wave of nausea through me. It wasn't the thing that had followed me from above. No. This was something older, something that had been waiting longer than the building itself. It reached out toward me, its hands, pale and cold as death, stretched toward me, trembling slightly, as if beckoning me closer. I could hear it now, the whispering, rising from the depths of its chest, as though it had never learned to speak in anything but murmurs. The voice was familiar, faint, ancient. 1,000 forgotten souls buried beneath the weight of years. It was calling me by name. It was telling me to come closer, and in that moment I knew. Waverly had not just held the dead. It had become them. It had swallowed them whole. And now, it was asking for me. I turned then, my legs moving without thought, without hesitation. The air seemed to tear around me, a wild gust pulling me back toward the stairs. I didn't dare look behind me. I couldn't. I didn't want to see what was following. I didn't want to know if I was already too late. By the time I reached the top of the stairs, I felt the room shift again, the air closing in, pushing me toward the door that led out. It wasn't the building now that had its grip on me. It was them. And I knew, as I stumbled into the hallway, that there was no way out. Not for me, not for anyone who had come to Waverly, because Waverly never lets you leave. The moment I stepped out of the basement, I felt the weight of the building behind me, pushing, pulling, as though Waverly itself was urging me onward towards something I couldn't name, something that had waited far longer than I had been alive. But even as I walked, or perhaps as I fled, I knew. I knew the truth I hadn't wanted to face. There is no leaving Waverly. Not truly. Not when you felt it. I stumbled through the hallways, my footsteps muffled by the thick air, the heavy stillness. The place seemed to close in around me, walls shifting, doors opening and closing with a mind of their own. The dim lights flickered above, casting brief shadows that danced in the corners, in the places where light had no right to go. I could hear them now, the voices, the whispers that had always been there, but were never quite voices. Not until now. They weren't just behind me anymore. They were inside my mind. They were in the air I breathed. They were me. The first floor felt miles away, though I knew I hadn't walked far. The staircase I had come down before had disappeared. The way forward was now blocked by a shadow, an unmovable wall that wasn't there a moment ago. It was no longer the hallways that twisted. It was the very space around me. Waverly had folded itself in on itself. It was a labyrinth, not just of stone, but of time itself, of memory. I found myself in the dining room, though it wasn't the room I remembered. The walls had collapsed inward, the windows cracked like shattered glass. The chairs were overturned, the tables covered in dust, in old, forgotten things. But it wasn't the ruin that unsettled me. It was the feeling, that heavy, suffocating weight of the building's past, pressing into my chest, forcing me to remember things I couldn't possibly know. I was not alone here. I never had been. I don't know how long I stood there. The silence was too thick to break. The air was too cold to breathe. I could feel the building breathing with me, the echoes of those long gone, of those who had once filled these halls. Their laughter, their sorrow, their breath, still lingering in the corners of the room, in the broken windows, in the old photographs that clung to the walls like memories trying to escape. And there, standing in the centre of the room, was a chair, simple, wooden, worn with time. But it wasn't the chair that stopped me. It was the shadow cast across the floor, the shape that bent wrong in the fading light. It was a figure, hunched over the chair. It was watching me. I stepped closer, my breath shallow, my mind buzzing with the images that knew me. I couldn't turn away. I couldn't. The figure, the shadow, didn't move. Its back was bent, its head lowered. But I could feel its eyes on me, piercing, unblinking, as if it had always been there, waiting for me, waiting for this moment. And I knew what it was. It was the one who had never left, the one who had watched all these years from the corner of the room, from the darkness that had swallowed its soul. It had lived here, and in every room, and in every breath, it had waited. It wasn't a person anymore. It was part of the building. It was part of me. I closed my eyes for a moment, not wanting to see, but knowing I had to. And when I opened them again, the figure was gone. The room was empty. The chair was still. But the air had changed. It was thick, alive, moving with the weight of something else. The whispers were louder now. They filled the room, buzzing in my ears, filling the spaces where thoughts used to be. The thing about Waverly is that it doesn't let you go, not by force, not by chains or locks. It doesn't need those. It doesn't need to trap you in a room. It traps you in time. I heard the footsteps again, closer this time. They weren't behind me or in the walls. They were right next to me. They were in me. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. I couldn't remember who I was before this moment. The door to the dining room, the one I had been sure was blocked, was open. The hallway beyond it was as dark as the basement. The shadows stretched too long. I stepped toward it, but my feet felt heavy, like I was sinking into the ground, like the building itself was pulling me under. I turned, and there, standing in the doorway, was the figure again. Only now it was clearer, closer. I saw its face, though I didn't want to. It was the face of everyone who had ever walked these halls. It was the face of the children, of the nurses, of the doctors, of the ones who had never left. They all looked the same hollow eyes, the same empty, waiting gaze. And then the building spoke. Not in words, but in breath. It didn't ask. It didn't beg. It simply remembered. And as it remembered, I felt myself being pulled into it, into the walls, into the floor. I understood then that it wasn't me who had come to Waverly. It was Waverly who had come for me. And as I stood there, frozen, unable to move, unable to speak, I realized the truth. The moment you step inside Waverly, you don't just enter its halls. You become part of them. And so I remain. A voice in the dark, a whisper in the walls, a memory that refuses to die.